Hey, good morning, Lycians. How are you doing today? Welcome to another EAPP online lesson. For this lesson, we'll be talking about critical approaches or criticism approaches, part one, in a very comprehensive way. As you may have known, I've sent you mini lessons a few weeks back about critical approaches or criticism theories or criticism approaches. So for this lesson, we'll be talking about it or about part one in a very comprehensive way. Let's start. So to start off, we'll be talking about formalism, structuralism, deconstruction, and post-structuralism for this part one lesson. So let's start with formalism. Now, as previously mentioned, formalism is actually very text-based. It puts importance of the literary form. Everything else is irrelevant. Now, according to Aristotle, um, with formalism, we look at the object, the manner, and means and of effort of imitation, or the moment of catharsis within a particular art form, may it be a book, movie, or a visual art in the vein of painting or a drawing. Also, formalism encourages close reading of the text without relying on the poet's or the artist's reputation or history. So we won't be talking about the author. The author is dead in formalism. Also, formalism focuses on organization and structure, verbal nuances, since um, in a very literary um, vein, we'll be doing verbal nuances and the multiple meanings within a particular art form. So, what does it mean? We won't be looking at meanings from different books or different movies. We'll be looking at just one movie or one book, and then we analyze it using the elements present in that particular book or in that particular movie. Now, since we'll be talking about formalism in a very comprehensive way, we'll be talking about three types of formalism. We have practical criticism, which is actually formalism, new criticism, and Russian formalism, and the work of Mikhail Bakhtin. Now let's start with formalism or practical criticism. Now, according to I.A. Richards, that is Ivor Armstrong Richards, practical criticism started formalism. Um, Instead of studying about history and the author, according to Richards, why not give the poem to a student and talk about the poem only? So in this particular case, we are taking in the vein of literary or literature, wherein we take a poem, give it to the students, let them analyze it, look at the words, the organizations, and whatnot, and let them present their analysis by analyzing only the poem. If, let's say, for example, a film, we look at the film, we don't look at the director's history or reputation or the actor's reputation, but we'll be solely talking about the film, the elements within the film, the characters' actions, their decision making within the film. That's a very formalist approach. Of course, all three are doing the same thing, but we'll be talking about the differences later on. So that's practical criticism or formalism. Now, with American formalism or new criticism, this approach discourages the use of history and biography in interpreting a literary work. So it's the same with practical criticism. What's different with new criticism is that um, instead of just plainly looking at the text and analyzing the text, we consider, or with new criticism, they consider that probably the meaning of that particular text, or probably there is another meaning if we use a different lens or we ask another person about it. So that's the thing with new criticism. It is not mainly just formalism. It is formalism plus something else. So it encourages readers to discover the meaning of a work through a detailed analysis of the text itself. So a detailed analysis. So let's say, for example, let's try to compare practical criticism and new criticism. Let's say, for example, we are talking about, um, say, give me a movie. Let's say Avengers Endgame. Let's talk about the Infinity Stones. So, in a very practical criticism approach, we we look at the we look at the Infinity Stones and we analyze them in terms of the different powers that they give. So we have the Time Stone, we have the Soul Stone, we have the Power Stone, etc. And by those powers, we can derive meaning, practical criticism. We don't need to look for a comics of Avengers so that we might know the meaning of those Infinity Stones and their powers. We just look at the movie, we observe, that's it. Now, if you're going to take a new criticism approach or the American formalistic approach, you look at the Infinity Stones and you take on a detailed approach. Let's say we have the Time Stone, the Power Stone. What do these stones mean? If we look at them separate, do they have the same power? Or do they have lesser power since they are not together? When they're together, of course, they have, infinite power, thus the Infinity Gauntlet. Um, if separated, are they still um, that big of a threat or that big of a power? If so, um, then therefore it is the it is an object of something else. Judging that they all um, want to keep either want to keep it them for themselves, Infinity Stone, or to keep it from others so that it won't get abused. So those cases. Now with Russian formalism, same thing. It is still a formalistic approach, but with Russian formalism, it attempts a scientific analysis, oh, excuse me, of the formal literary devices used in a text. So essentially, it is sounding like a structuralist approach to analysis. Now, how do I say so? I'll be telling you more about it when we go to the structuralism approach. But basically, it's a very structuralistic approach, mainly because of the word scientific analysis. When you are doing a formalistic approach, we don't necessarily use a very scientific approach. You just look at the words, you read it closely, that's formalism. But if you make, let's say, an assumption or a hypothesis, then we implore a very scientific approach, and that would be a very structuralist approach towards a text. So that's Russian formalism. Now, with the case of Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin, um, his thought on formalism is a bit complex. So let's say, for example, his work, sorry, his concept and his idea towards utterances and what he calls the speech genre. Now, there are many genres in speech. May it be written, spoken, in the form of a song or spoken word poetry, or in terms of movies and television. Those are speech genres. Every speech genre has different utterances, and these utterances, they are eventful, meaning they only exist in a particular time, and it will not exist anymore on a different time. Mainly because it is solely exclusive to that particular time and that particular super. So, for example, this is the utterance, this is the speech genre, it only exists on a particular speech genre. It will not exist on a different speech genre. So that's Mikhail Bakhtin. So of course, if you're going to analyze something, you analyze it using a formalistic approach plus um, when it was written and how it was written. So utterance and speech genre. If you are, let's say for example, you become confused on how to use these approaches in analysis, we'll have a separate lesson about that so that you'll be um, you'll have more time to think and more materials to use when you become confused on a particular lesson with EAPP. But yeah, basically with formalism, it is a text-based approach. Um, we as much as possible we don't necessarily implore a scientific approach unless you're doing a Russian formalist approach and Mikhail Bakhtin's approach towards analysis of a particular text or a particular art form. All right, now moving on, let's go to the next approach, structuralism. But before that, I want to clarify something. Structuralism, deconstruction, post-structuralism, they are actually almost the same. As a matter of fact, formalism up to post-structuralism, they are almost the same because they are very objective in nature. They study the text or the art form exclusively, but with different variation. Now, with structuralism, deconstruction, and post-structuralism, deconstruction and post-structuralism came out or is an upgrade from structuralism. What does it mean? It means that deconstruction is the opposite, total opposite of structuralism, and post-structuralism is an upgraded structuralist approach. So how does it work? Let me show you. Structuralism. Now, structuralism is developed from the linguistic theory of Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure is the father of modern linguistics. So it should the method basically came from him. Now, with structuralism, it concentrates on literature or the art form as a system of signs that have no coherent meaning, inherent meaning, except in their agreed upon or conventional relation to one another. If you remember Mikhail Bakhtin, a while back, we have the utterance and speech genre. So with the linguistic theory of Ferdinand de Saussure, we have what we call the lang or the utterance and the genre, the speech genre. So we have those. Before I forget, before we move forward, all the proponents here, even though if I may be able to discuss them either thoroughly or not, it is your responsibility, my dear students, to look for other materials to study their approach and their method. Why? Number one, it will be very beneficial for you in terms of analysis of whatever art form or whatever text that you may want to analyze, whether it may be in EAPP or a different subject. Second, you need to study their work not for the subject but for yourself. Okay, that's that's a sneak peek towards EAPP's mini performance task later on. We'll see. Either I'll be giving it to you as a classroom or still online, but still quicker. At least there's a good news. We have no video calls or Zoom conferences for EAPP unless you have questions, of course. Anyway, going back. So with structuralism, it concentrates on literature as a system of science. Now with structuralism, it makes us think of a particular art form, but in this particular case, literature, as a part of a larger system of language. And the fact that everything we know, one thing of something, is that something is not something else. Meaning to say, we have a universal meaning, only one meaning. And it is part of a larger system of language. since we are from the linguistic theory. Now, let's make it a bit more complex. For structuralism, we have four types of structuralism approach. We have linguistic, anthropological, structural Marxism, and post-structuralism. Okay, let's start with linguistics. Now, it starts with Ferdinand de Saussure. We have the concept of a signifier and a signified. Now, the signifier is a word representation, and the signified is the idea is the ideal representation of the signifier. Later on, I'll be discussing this more thoroughly. With anthropological, we'll be talking about Claude Levi-Strauss. His work is still very Saussurean. He still follows the signifier and the signified concept with the addition of anthropological aspect of a text material. So what does it mean? If let's say, for example, you read a book, you look at a word, and you find, let's say, you see a word in that particular book, and then immediately, automatically, you imagine the signified representation of that signifier, then you have one meaning. But in this case, with Claude Levi-Strauss, he implores or he uses his concept of binary oppositions. With binary oppositions, we have one word and the opposing word of that particular word. So let's say, for example, with life, the opposite of life is death. The opposite of male is female, man, woman, young person, and an old person. So those are binary oppositions, which are always present in a text, if it is literature or in a particular visual art form, either in film or in a painting. So he uses a binary opposition approach to structuralism. Also, he studies culture and a little bit of hint when it comes to biology. So that's anthropological. Now, structural Marxism, we'll be looking at. You should be looking at the works of Louis Althusser, um, Nikos Poulantzas, and Godelier. So, according to them, structuralism didn't start with Ferdinand de Saussure. It actually started with Karl Marx, mainly because Karl Marx was able to um, analyze the society and uh, gave it different signifiers. So that's a variation with structural Marxism. But ultimately, with structural Marxism approach, we use structuralism as a method or approach to study social realities, whether it may be economic, social, or gender based. Now, the last one, post-structuralism. Post-structuralism, we go back to Ferdinand de Saussure, Glenn Ward, and Ritzer. Now, the meaning of a word, according to post-structuralism, is never present in the word itself. Let's say, for example, with structuralism, linguistic structuralism, when you see the word death in a book or in a novel that you're reading, immediately what you're thinking is the end of life. Easy. With post-structuralism, that word doesn't have any meaning. How? What kind of death are we talking about? Physical? Is it physical death? What kind of physical death? Is it the physical death wherein life exits your body, or is it physical death in terms of metaphysical? Those kinds of things. Now, before we go any further, if you are confused with structuralist approach, let's try to explain it in a very interesting way. This is how. Now we have structuralism, four types of structuralist approach. We have linguistic, anthropological, structural Marxism, and post-structural Marxism. Now, as a general structuralism rule, this is our sign, universal sign. We have our signifier below, which is the word bitch. Above it is a signified representation or the ideal representation, which is a dog. Now, as some of you may know, when you say bitch, linguistically speaking, it is talking about a female dog. Okay? So, here's what I mean. We have a single signifier, which is bitch. If we apply the linguistic structuralism approach, then we are talking about a female dog. If we're using the anthropological approach, then we're talking about a dog because dogs walk on all fours. And basically, when you say bitch, um, it originated from a particular from a particular speech genre or a particular language or of a country that uses this particular word to um, to describe a female dog. In which case, we are talking about culture now because we're talking about the country's language. Next, structural Marxism. In this particular example, we are talking about it as a derogatory adjective. And when you use the word bitch towards a person, whether it may be a female or male, you are referring to that particular person as inferior, mainly because in a very structural approach, since bitch, linguistically speaking, is represented by a female dog, if we abstract the meaning, it is talking about an animal of the female type. So in this particular case, therefore, it is a symbol that females follow the lead of an alpha person. When you say an alpha person, it may be a female or a male. So whether you're using this word for a male person or for a female person, it still has the meaning that it is derogatory and that you're calling that particular person as inferior. That's structural Marxism. It has that particular power struggle, mainly because of the derogatory element in that particular word. Post-structuralism. Now, when you say bitch, of course, it represents a female dog, but it doesn't stop there. Does the word bitch exclusive to describe a female dog? Can it be used to denote other female animals? In this particular case, a human being. Can we use bitch to describe a female whale? Those kinds of things. Okay? But always remember with structuralism, there's always the concept of uniformity or universal sign of a particular um, speech or utterance. So structuralism. Okay? Deconstruction. Let's go to deconstruction. Now, as previously mentioned with the mini lesson, deconstruction developed out of structuralism. Um, it encourages, it encourages that everything means nothing. Everything could mean something else. Everything or something can have multiple meanings to a different text. Meaning to say, they introduce the concept of intertextuality. Also, deconstruction, every text has within itself some way of unraveling itself and taking it apart and finding these inconsistencies so that we might be able to understand it. For this particular approach, we'll be talking about Jacques Derrida's concept and how do we use or how do we do a deconstruction approach. Now, Derrida suggested that all interpretation of a text simply constitutes further text, meaning if you have an idea of a meaning of that particular word, then therefore it constitutes further text, meaning you need to read more. Let's say, for example, from one book to another book. Let's say the word death, does it have the same meaning? If yes, then are they verbatim, very the same, or are they somewhat the same? If they're very different, then what makes them different? Those kinds of questions. Also, this means there is no outside the text at all. So still very formalistic approach, very objective. You look at the text. Therefore, it is impossible for a text to have a stable meaning. So that's what I said. It is impossible for a text to have a stable meaning, mainly because in a very deconstruction method, um, when you have an idea of the meaning of that particular word, are you sure that it is universal to all novels? So that's how we think with deconstruction. Now, with deconstruction, it encourages you to do a second reading for literature, for visual art forms like film and painting, a second look. Now, the first look or the first reading, you're supposed to point out um, where it seems to have determinate meanings, very obvious meanings. On the second reading, not necessarily after, for example, you read, um, let's have a thick book, let's say Game of Thrones. So after reading that book, Game of Thrones, it is not necessary that you reread it again on the same day. Probably after you have made the analysis on your first reading, that's the time you do your second reading. On the second reading, you would question what is accepted in that particular novel um, as a natural or self-evident, looking to find places where the attitudes or assumptions identified on the first reading are contradicted or undermined. Meaning to say, are they still the same? Does it still have, or does it still hold the same meaning, or does it still hold a very universal meaning of that particular word? Now that's deconstruction. Again, for deconstruction, you need to study Jacques Derrida's approach towards deconstruction. He was also a structuralist before, but he started this particular concept of deconstructing. Now, how do we do a deconstruction approach, and how do we do a structuralist approach? How do we apply them in analysis, in the context of analysis or analyzing a particular art form or literature? You'll need to have to wait for that particular lesson. I'll be presenting that on Quipper as well, if given that we're still going to do a online class. Okay, now moving on with post-structuralism. Before that, this is what I mean. Let's say, for example, the word bitch on one book, it means female dog. Does it still hold universal meaning on the second book? Does it still mean a dog, or does it mean the human person, or does it mean something else? So that's how you would question when you're doing a second reading with deconstruction. Now, finally, post-structuralism. Post-structuralism came out of structuralism, and it criticized structuralism, the former, for its claim to scientific objectivity, including its assumption that the system of science in which language operates was stable or universal. With post-structuralism, with the absence of a universal meaning, post-structuralists would replace the fixation on it by eliciting meanings from other books. So they would need to read other books of the same author. They would need to elicit meaning from other readers, other experts, in a different context, and so on and so forth. So that's post-structuralism. It is still a very structuralist approach, but with different methods and different ways of doing a structuralist approach. Now, with structuralism, we have we have the concept of signifier and signified, ultimately making the universal meaning of the sign or the sign. So with structuralism, it was always represented with a circle, with the signifier below and the signified above. Now let's make it into a square, quadrilateral. We have our signifier to your left and the signified representation to your right. Below that is the description that it is the universal sign of a female dog. So this is how you will think as a post-structuralist. Let's say we change the signified representation. We change it into a female person or a person. So this means that the signifier bitch accompanied by the different signified representation, which is a female person. The sign is now a universal sign of a female human person having certain attributes in the likeness of a dog. So, same signifier, two meanings. So it it um it basically eliminates the concept that a signifier will have a universal meaning. Now, furthermore, are you sure that the word bitch is solely for tangible and living thing? Let's say we use bitch in the context of a situation wherein the character is or was situated, of which leaves or left a bad impression of his or her circumstances in a general term of life, wherein the character would describe his or her life as unfortunate. Kung sa Bisaya pa, gimalas, malason. This is from Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is also a structuralist, was also a structuralist before, but since he thought that we can actually have only a universal meaning towards a particular text, then um, he thought that if we if if we eliminate or in the absence of a universal meaning, how much can we add to the meaning of that particular sign or signifier? So that's how post-structuralism works. Now, my dear students, we've reached the end of our part 1 lesson. On part 2, we'll be talking about theories such as Marxism, feminism, post-colonial, queer theory, and reader response. A very subjective kind of way. A very subjective lot of theories and approaches. All right, so again, reminding all of you that all of the proponents here, you need to study them, make it very simple for you so that you'll be able to understand them well and quickly. You need to search for them or you need to study them not for the subject but for yourself, mainly because it will benefit you when you are doing an analysis on a particular subject. On EAPP's, actually on EAPP's performance tasks, mini performance tasks, and other written works. Since we don't have an exam, we only have a long test, so we have a bunch of things we need to comply. Also reminding you that in this paper lesson, there is a set of questions that you need to answer. Only the first try would be recorded if it is an assignment. If it is a quiz, you can't repeat it or redo it. With assignments, you can actually redo it. Sorry for that. I accidentally moved the tripod. With assignments, you can actually redo it. But if it's a quiz, then once is enough. So again, reminding you that in this particular Quipper lesson, there is a corresponding set of questions you need to answer. Also, I've noticed before that students would not complete the lesson, and then they would go directly to the questions part. Now, for EAPP, I'll be giving students who completed the lesson and the set of questions additional points. So given that they did um, finish the lesson and the set of questions, meaning to say they were present at that particular scheduled time. Okay. Now, although this lesson will be available for the rest of the day, I would highly suggest, and also I would be recording attendance of EAPP on our scheduled time. So yes, I'll still be checking attendance, but on the designated EAPP schedule. So let's say, for example, if our schedule is 8 to 10, 9 to 10:30, um, if, for example, you did the lesson and the set of questions after 10:30, you'll be marked as absent still. Okay, so still follow the correct scheduling for each lesson. Okay, so I hope this lesson finds you well. I hope you find this lesson also very interesting. When I say interesting, I mean you are very hyped and at some point slightly confused, prompting you to study the approaches by different proponents. Again, this is EAPP's critical approach part 1, very comprehensive stuff, a lot of information to dive into, and I hope to see you in class when we get back to school. Stay safe, stay home, and stay healthy. Ciao.